Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lisa Melandri. I'm the director here at the museum, and it is our delight and our pleasure to be opening a new and wonderful season here at CAM. It is also our distinct pleasure to have so many extraordinary artists with us this morning and to talk about our great, sometimes chaotic, very therapeutic, maybe a little anxiety-ridden, but also joyful exhibition, Occupational Therapy. And to get us started, I would like to very much thank and introduce Kelly Shindler, our Associate Curator and the Curator of the exhibition. Kelly.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for coming this morning. So we're very thrilled and privileged to have these wonderful artists here with us this morning. I'm going to go from my left, so stage left. We have Martin Brief, Deb Sokolow, William Powhida, and Buzz Spector. And before we get started, I just have a few thank yous. I wanted to thank David Zwirner Gallery in New York, Goethe Institute in Chicago, the German Culture Center at the University of Missouri St. Louis, Onsteller Rays New York, Jessica Silverman Gallery in San Francisco, Grieder Contemporary in Zurich, Petzel Gallery, and also Sonnabend Gallery in New York and Tyler Fine Arts here in St. Louis, all for making this exhibition possible. So thank you very much to those supporters. I also want to thank our wonderful interns who worked really hard on this exhibition. Maddie Brooker, who's worked on the sanatorium, Erin Mahoney, Henry Osmond, and Madeline Vermeulen, all of whom are curatorial interns for all of their hard work and dedication to the show. My colleagues Alex Elmstead manning the video camera for project managing the Pedro Reyes Sanatorium, and Jesse Cerruti, our registrar, for the gorgeous installation. My colleague Jeffrey Usla for encouraging me to include all of Rochelle Feinstein's Love Vibe paintings, which I'm so thrilled that I listened to you and took your advice for that because it really anchors the show together. And all of CAM's wonderful staff for their hard work and dedication commitment to all of the wonderful exhibitions that are on view here for the summer season. So just a little bit about the exhibition to ground the conversation. Occupational Therapy is a group show featuring the work of 20 artists who are all addressing the questions that haunt an artist working in the studio today, addressing the challenges and complexities of being an artist in various ways, from how does one find inspiration to reconciling one's position within art history, past and future, to negotiating the contours of the marketplace and the art, the complicated art ecosystem, to thinking about how to find inspiration. All of the artists here on the panel address these questions in different ways. All of the work in the show looks at these questions and more in various ways across photography, sculpture, installation, video, and drawing. We're going to talk a lot about drawing today. One major anchor project in the exhibition is Pedro Reyes' Sanatorium, a participatory artwork that flips the opportunity to engage in art therapy around and offer it to you as viewers. And the sanatorium will be open for treatment after the talk from 12 to 1 and then again from 2 to 4 o'clock today. It's all free, all volunteer driven and run and powered, and we encourage you to participate and find a volunteer therapist in a lab coat and book your treatment with them after the talk to kind of process what we're talking, what happens in this discussion up here today. A little bit about our panelists, again from my stage left. Martin Brief lives and works here in St. Louis. He's a professor at St. Louis University in graphic design, right? Yeah, we talked about that last night. He received his MFA from SIU Carbondale. He was one of the winners of the 2010 Great Rivers Biennial here at CAM, so some of you will remember that exhibition with his project Amazon God. Other recent solo exhibitions include Success at the Isolation Room, Art Forum at Bruno David Gallery across the street, an And a piece from that exhibition is featured in our show here today, right as you walk in. He's also been featured in numerous group exhibitions at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, at the Delaware Center for the Contemporary Arts, and more. Deb Sokolow, sitting next to Martin, lives and works in Chicago, and she traveled from Chicago to work on her installation here in the exhibition. Hers is the storyboard work on paper titled "You Tell People You're Working Really Hard on Things These Days, Part 2. Deb augmented that piece by drawing directly on the gallery walls. And her recent solo exhibitions include All Your Vulnerabilities Will Be Assessed at Texas State University, a Matrix show at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, You Are One Step Closer to Learning the Truth at the Other Kemper Museum in Kansas City. And she's been featured in numerous group exhibitions, including Artadia's 15th anniversary show at Longhouse Projects in New York, At Work, Studio and Production as a Site of Today's Art at, I can't speak German, at the Museum for Fine Art in Siegen, Germany. And artists tell stories mostly about themselves at the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Arizona. William Powhida, to my right, joins us today from Brooklyn. His recent solo exhibitions include the Unretrospective at the Platform Gallery in Seattle, a show Bill by Bill at Charlie James in Los Angeles, an exhibition at the Gallery Polson in Copenhagen, and Powhida at Marlborough Gallery in New York. His work's been featured in many group exhibitions at the Wattis Institute, in San Francisco, at Pierogi in Brooklyn, at the Charlotte Street Foundation in Kansas City, and at Freight and Volume in New York. And Buzz Spector, of course you know, teaches at Washington University here in St. Louis. He's been featured in many solo exhibitions, including at Off the Shelf at the Grunwald Gallery at Indiana University in Bloomington, Malevich with 8 Red Rectangles at Bruno David, an eponymous exhibition at Zola Lieberman in Chicago, and too many group exhibitions to count. And I think it's important also to note that all of the artists here with us today are all educators. Besides Martin and Buzz, William teaches in a studio program in New York, the New York Studio Residency Program, and Deb teaches at Northwestern in Chicago. So please join me in welcoming all of our distinguished panelists here today. So this talk will function as our talks usually do. So we'll talk amongst ourselves, have a discussion, a conversation, and then we'll open it up to you to ask your questions. So hopefully you'll have some scintillating ones for our panelists today. I want to start off with a medium-specific question about drawing. That's an interesting connection that ties all of your work together here in the exhibition. Buzz, I'm speaking more figuratively because obviously your work is not a literal drawing here in the show, but of course you've made millions of drawings and that's a huge part of your practice. I'm interested in how the hand-lawn drawing, of course, refers back to each of you as a maker of that mark, an author of that mark, and I'm hoping you can each talk about your interest in drawing as a strategy and how it informs your work. And there's no particular order, so just jump right in.
Well, I think I'll go first because clarification is in order. The work you see out in the gallery is a drawing. If you accept that every line in a drawing is an edge, the effect of that work is of one edge after another. And I used to think of what I did to reams of paper or the texts of books as a kind of critical evisceration, but in fact it's closer in affect to the drawings, which were my sole creative output the first 10 years of my art career.
Well, I think for me, I mean, drawing was a way as an art student to kind of think differently about what it meant to be an artist. You know, I kind of, in my junior year at Syracuse University, I was doing a lot of large-scale paintings and working with abstraction. I went to New York for a summer and basically came back to Syracuse and put away all my paints, and I wanted to think about what does it mean to be an artist? And drawing was this thing that, you know, seemed to have a lot more freedom, and maybe there wasn't as much baggage, and it became a way of working for a number of years as a kind of maybe a way around painting. And it also lent itself to this idea of like notational, taking notes and recording things and writing to a large degree, and those two things eventually just kind of folded into my practice. So like writing art criticism and also thinking about being an artist. And you know, drawing was fast, it was kind of quick, it was, you know, also it seemed like a strategy to avoid the, you know, I guess, you know, when I was in school there was this kind of idea that, you know, and we know this, that like modernist painting was this kind of like totalizing narrative about truth. And my work was fiction. There was a lot of fiction and satire, and drawing just made a lot more sense as a method. And lastly, like coming out of school into Williamsburg in the early 2000s, there were a lot of artists who were using drawings in very interesting ways, like Mark Lombardi and Don Clements, and it felt like I was walking into a community that gave me a lot of permission to do things that didn't quite feel like art.
Yeah, it seems very much like drawing is particularly germane to the themes of this exhibition, and it really anchors some of these questions that I mentioned earlier. Deb, do you want to
Okay,
follow up?
is this on?
It's on.
It's good? Okay. Well, I think William pretty much spoke for me on most of what he just said. But to add to some of his thoughts, really for me, writing is really a type of drawing process. Or drawing is sort of a type of writing process. I do a lot of writing, handwritten text, and then I make erasures, edits, constantly whiting out the mistakes, or maybe I just don't like the way that it's been written, or the way that the sentence is functioning when you read it. So there's so many layers, there's so many mistakes, and et cetera, and so that becomes a type of drawing process, the give and the take, and the put it there, take it back, it's horrible, cross out the whole thing. But also writing to me in drawing, you know, it's sort of this idea I have that you think about painting and how it can hold a wall. A big painting can hold a wall, a big sculpture can hold a space, but no one ever thinks that drawing can hold that much space. So for me, the goal is to try and get drawing to hold that space and be a monumental thing in the room. And that's the challenge, at least for me, with drawing. You know, how can you make someone really spend a lot of time with it, more than a half second, you know, oh, I see that and I keep walking. You know, having the opportunity for someone to actually spend 5-10 minutes with a drawing is amazing. So for me, you know, I don't always get to that point where that happens, but if I ever make a piece and that happens, I know that, you know, that maybe it worked on some level.
In my work, I think a lot about the relationship between language and drawing as systems of description. And so the lines I'm making with text I see them as part of a line drawing. And when you get up close, you can read it, and it becomes language. And if you take a few steps back, the language disappears, and then you end up with a non-objective drawing, I guess. And so that relationship between those two systems is what I really like about using drawing. I guess that's...
Yeah, I think this idea of drawing's legibility, or how you read a drawing, how it can pull you in, relates to my next question, which is, I'm interested in talking more about text and narrative. This exhibition is very heavy on that. And in organizing the show, I was really interested in how artists think, and how you reconcile your relationship to the art world, but also the world at large. And each of you crafts an incredible story, whether through book objects, as you do, Buzz, or an kind of investigative reporting on the art world writ large, as you do, William, about intrigue and mystery, about many things, Deb, or an indirect commentary on how information structures our world. Martin, I think your work through text creates connections or links to other kinds of information or ideas. So let's talk about the role of text in each of your practices, and why is narrative with or without, why is text with or without narrative so important to you, or essential to you, or your work?
I hardly know where to start. It's like saying, what is the role of a pencil? Every artist is invested in precisely the fiction that William referred to. We make stuff up, right? And so in making stuff up, we find a way of going even further towards the absurd or the miraculous than mere language can provide us. I used to have a big problem titling my work, and I discovered that making books into art objects solved that problem, because the title was delivered intact and in place. I think a lot about how working with the book as an art object, the memory of reading infuses anybody's gaze at what I've wrought. One thing I was wrong about in tearing pages out of books to make sculpture is that people were nowhere near as offended as I wished them to be. I'm thinking about this as a kind of labor-intensive, obsessive vandalism of a remarkably inefficient sort. And I would present these books to people who would say, "Oh, that's so gorgeous, can I touch?" Which, there's something icky about that, especially given the household I grew up in which books were semi-sacred objects. In fact, I feel like this show has been therapeutic for me in a couple of ways. It's made me think about what all artists do as a form of outpatient therapy, in which a way of acting on unspeakable crises that just come with being alive can be given form through the adeptness of penmanship, say, or a willingness to consider an eraser as a positive in making a work, or in creating graphic situations in which one typo ruins months of work.
So on that note of vandalism.
Well, I think I've been accused of, engaging in a kind of career vandalism, of, referencing other specific artists and their practices. But that, for me, it was never sort of like a personal attack. I think now we're sort of much more familiar with the idea of kind of trolling through internet culture. But early on for me, it was about the kind of artist narratives that were being told, and the way the artist narratives and the stories we told ourselves about how the art world worked were changing very rapidly. Like when I came out of graduate school in 2001, the art market was sort of booming around us, and artists were sort of taking off and having this kind of overnight success. And the sort of why that was happening was a big question that I wanted to pursue. And I think in terms of narrative, when I also was in school, I had a professor tell me once, where I heard somebody say, my painting doesn't have room for stories. And I was sitting there thinking, well, your painting is a story. This kind of history of modernism and what it means, and it's a sacred story, and it has a lot of power in it, and to kind of question that can, be troubling to some people. So I think, I tend to think of art itself as a narrative and a story, and that I don't see a big separation between kind of the form of letters or words. It's something that I think we can engage. And to do that, to kind of think about all these different stories, that's where my interest in, the very specific kinds of like artist biographies or artist statements, or these things that we create that, are trying to like get at some truth, but at the same time are also building value and changing people's perceptions of these objects like titles, I can't look at a Pollock with, like the title Full Fathom 5 or, Lucifer, and not allow these things to change how I'm seeing something that's non-representational or fully abstract. So these things have just always been sort of entry points for me into why storytelling becomes important, and storytelling from lists and letters to creating a character named Powhida and putting him into a big flawed blue chip gallery and letting things go a little bit out of hand. But I think that's we're dealing with all sorts of narratives and largely perceptions, how we see and understand things.
Which is incredibly subjective, too, in that way. Yeah.
Okay.
Are you interested in responding?
Well, I don't know. I mean, yes, always. But no, I think something I was just reminded of, which was a seminal moment for me. It was in grad school in 2003, 2004, and this was at the School of the Art Institute, and there were two professors who separately looked at the work, came into my studio and saw these two very large, 9.5 feet across drawings, very text-driven narrative, not a linear narrative, but a very non-linear narrative. And the first professor, who was a scholar of minimalism, that was his focus, looked at the work from maybe 10 feet away and looked at me and he said, "I don't like to read art," and left the studio. And then the second professor, about a month later, and this was in a critique situation in the studio, shut down the conversation by simply saying, looking at your work is like doing homework, and I don't want to do it. I don't read art. So these were two wonderful challenges that have, moments where I thought, oh, really? Well, now I know what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to prove you wrong. And so that's really been like a guiding force in my life. And I won't say I won't give names, but I really credit them for those two professors for giving me a kick in the butt, and for having a sense of purpose about what to do. How can you get someone to read art, and can that be an acceptable thing? Everyone's familiar with reading, a story in a book, but why not on the wall? And why not have it be this thing that you can continue to come back to again and again and actually spend time with? But I also think about narrative, and for me it's really about commentary around a story. I am interested in fact and fiction, unreliable narrators, the questions that people always come and ask me, is that really true? I think one of the first drawings ever made, my parents came to see the work. They didn't know what I was doing until that point. And my mother was reading the piece, and then she came up to me. She was very concerned, and she said, "Now, Deb, if there's a meth lab being run in your apartment building, you should really call the police, the Chicago police." And my father said, "Sandra, it's a work of fiction." So those two completely different responses to me are just, that was one of the greatest moments in my life. So I'll let you carry this on.
All right.
Where do you go from there?
Thanks. I guess, I'm just sitting here thinking about this question of narrative, and I guess I haven't really thought about my work that way necessarily, but I also am sitting here with people who have written their own work in a way. You create your own stories, and I think I don't know that I could do that, so that's why I've just used other people's text. I just steal and reconfigure or reimagine or just use it as raw information for my own work. And I think just, for me, what's interesting about that is I can look at what's out there and what people are seeing a lot of, like the art forum piece, or I've done a project with the New York Times, And those are really powerful sources of stories. And I think just by tapping into that, I can think about not only the content of those, but the structure, and to think a little bit about what those vehicles of stories, what their effect is and what their power is in our culture in creating the larger narratives that we buy into.
Yeah, I feel, Martin, with your work, you're taking information that's already out there in the world and kind of reconstituting and reconfiguring it to create inferred narratives. Like, you're putting it all together and orchestrating it in a way that allows us to make the connections, you know. They're choreographed in a way that helps us to complete the sentence in a way, if you will.
Yeah, thank you. I like the way you put that.
I want to talk about success and failure, because that's a huge theme in this exhibition as well. It's something we can all relate to as human beings. It's very an innate experience for all of us. And the show's questioning, and all of your work's questioning, what does it mean to be successful, and why do we value success so intensely? What happens when we literally put our failures or scrapped attempts at creativity on display? William, your crumpled paper sculptures demonstrate the revisionary nature of art practice, while an artist like John Baldessari and his art disasters posit failure as an essential and unavoidable element of art making. And the constellation of works in this show not only questions the empirical idea of success, in quotation marks, but in putting our various failures on view, they celebrate the fallible nature of art practice and in effect humanize the idea of the artist or the artist figure. And I'm curious why each of you have chosen to explore this theme in your work in various ways. We can go out of order too.
I like the order.
All right, I'll go first.
All right, Buzz, kick us off.
I'm thinking about how, Kelly, you had to go on and on about failure before I realized you weren't talking about galleries going out of business and work not purchased.
Which is part of the story too.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. I mean,
part of the package.
There's always that,
Yeah.
and there is the problem we all wrestle with of the work that fails in the studio, and it's a poor workman who blames his tools, right? So I own up to manifest countless failures for which the pencil or my right hand was not responsible, and it seems to me the essence of it was the momentary shadow my ego cast on what I was doing. And where the work will fail is when you are simultaneously doing it and admiring yourself for doing it.
For failing or for succeeding? I'm confused.
Often I go into the studio with an intent to make a work. And I don't want to mess it up. So I'll make another work to just sort of get into my groove and then be ready to do the work I had intended to do. Now, after 40 years, it's clear to me that most of my career is that work I was doing on my way to doing something else. I don't know if this resonates, but it's certainly how I've been able to keep going.
Those detours, in a way, or those kind of three ways, yeah.
I mean, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, when I give my artist talk, I show students my work from undergraduate where I thought I was doing something interesting, and then I don't show any images from graduate school because it was like a kind of 3.5-year failure in a sense that I didn't produce anything that was ready for presentation, or it wasn't. I didn't want to burden anyone with it. It was just bad stuff in some way. And I think about that, but it was that room to kind of fail and start to develop a voice and find somebody else who was interested in what that was doing that was different from kind of large-scale installations. And I needed that period, and it helped me make the kind of next leap into finding a kind of success in that people started responding to this kind of merger of a critical, kind of fictional, crazy art critic who is, it may not be very effective. In some ways, it's not even about just institutional critique of the systems of being an artist, but also the kind of pathos of critique and self-criticality and always sort of having to question yourself and sort of doubting all of it. And later, I don't know if anyone's ever read, if you haven't, you should read Mira Shore's essay on failure and anonymity, which is sort of a fantastic thing that, artists have to prepare for these long periods of, invisibility in some ways, not being relevant to a particular conversation, and taking risks so that you don't end up kind of repeating yourself, because it is a question that, I sort of continuously grapple with. Do I want to draw another sheet of paper? Do I want to, kind of repeat this thing? Even though, for me, I can sort of say, well, it's always sort of a different narrative piece going into it, so there's something that kind of changes, but I'm still trying to push the forms that I'm using to do that. But that, that notion of failure, in some ways, people just don't want to be around it in the art world. I mean, my friend Jen Dalton and I did a project that nobody will ever really know about called the Failure Hut, where we invited people to come in a kind of similar, not similar to the sanatorium, but it was participatory. You could fill out a survey of what constituted failure in your life, and was it ever generative? Did it lead to something? Was it good? And it was a sort of unmitigated disaster in some way, and our art dealers were like, no, just don't want to talk about that, But, I think ideas of success and what constitutes success do put a lot of pressure on artists to kind of repeat the things that, the market responds to, that curators respond to, and that can lead to a place where it becomes harder and harder to make changes, to a practice. But I'll pass that on to Deb, because I think, we had an interesting conversation last night where I was like, I haven't done too many museum shows, and I'm not sure if that's because I've alienated myself from so many curators and institutions, or if it's just because, my work does sell in a commercial context that, I don't know. And Deb's like, I've done tons of museum shows and not so many, gallery shows. So I don't know, we could talk about what that means in terms of success.
I think it has a lot to do with scale. And, when someone sees a big piece on a wall, a big drawing on a wall that looks a little bit ungainly, and maybe part of it's written on the wall, you can't really sell that, and it's hard to sell that in a commercial context. But I think what you've said about how no one wants to be around failure, and I think that's true. But I also do think that people are interested, maybe in a sneaky way about other people's failures. I mean, I'm always curious about how other artists manage their time. I know I have a lot of difficulties managing time because I'm always, everything else seems so interesting instead of the drawing I'm working on at the moment, And so, of course, that becomes the drawing, everyone else's story or perception, my perception of their story. I know I do want to bring this up. This isn't necessarily talking about failure, but in terms of being really curious about how other artists live their lives, or what they do in the studio, or how they do get through those tough moments. The first time I ever spied on another artist in a studio, this was in 1996, and I had just finished undergrad, and this was at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and I got this little studio in downtown Champaign, and I looked out the window into another window, and it looked like there was an artist's studio in there, and I was very curious about who the artist was and what hours they kept, and I never quite figured out who it was. And so a couple months went by, maybe 7 months went by, and finally the light was on in that studio, and I'm looking from my studio into that studio, and it's Buzz. Like, what is Buzz up to? I want to know. He was he was a professor of mine in undergrad.
I'm glad I didn't know. It's like kind of a Brian De Palma thing.
Right. No, but I really, Buzz was someone very influential on me, and it was an exciting moment to discover that it was him in that studio. But back to failure, though.
Are you saying Buzz didn't work for months?
No, I am not. What I'm saying is he kept different hours. Different hours than me, you know. So I think I've said my part. You can go ahead.
You know, the issue of success and failure is really, it's impossible for me to say anything about it. I don't have a clue what success is, you know, so
Didn't you have a whole show called Success?
I did. I made
This is the
piece.
title of your exhibition?
Yeah, I made for me a large drawing called Success, and that was the show. So yeah, it's basically a definition drawing, and I started with the word success, and I based it off of this thing I learned as a kid, that if you look up a word in the dictionary and you don't know what one of those words means, you should look that one up. And I just took that to an absurdity, I guess. And I basically looked up every word that was in the definition of success and wrote that down, and then went back and looked up every one of those words and made what I would call the complete definition of success. But it's one of those things that if you read the whole thing, you'd have even less idea what success is. But it's kind of like the art form drawing, in that if you stand back a little bit, it just becomes a gray square, and I felt like that was just as good a definition of success as any written definition might be. But I also, you know, I was sitting here and I was thinking, there's this quote I heard that I don't know where it came from, maybe someone else knows, where it says, an answer is just an excuse to stop thinking. And so I kind of feel like you could replace answer with success, and that way, to me, that's partly why I think I'm afraid if I was to have success, then I would be, hey, I'm done. I did it. So,
or comfort.
yeah. So
it's motivating for you.
I guess so, yeah. But I wouldn't. But at the same time, I don't look at work that I've done and say, "Oh, what a failure." I can't. I don't. Even though a lot of my life I live in black and white, and it's either this or it's this, and both ends are crazy. In this case, I think I can't really live in success or failure, even though I'm probably equally afraid of both.
I remember when I saw your drawings pinned up at the Luminary for an installation they'd done for you, and I made some remark about them, which made you realize that all of your work had been installed backwards.
Yeah.
Wait, can you explain that?
No, Martin can.
This was a series of drawings that I did on vellum, and so when they installed them, they flipped them. It wasn't actual text. It was a series of drawings based on text, but it was like a dot pattern, and so they didn't really. They just had it backwards, and so I just casually mentioned it to them at the opening.
So polite of you, Martin.
Opening?
Well, yeah, because I didn't go before, and maybe I should learn a lesson about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it didn't look that different, really. So.
Well, I want to talk more about exhaustion and indexing, which, you know, of course, Martin, your work is a wonderful example of that. That's the philosophical casino being activated back there, so don't be alarmed. It's another formal and conceptual theme of the exhibition, which is about indexing, of exhausting all possible scenarios in a seemingly endless abyss of lists of narrative directions and non-resolutions. From reconstituting an artist's biography, as you do, Buzz, of creating checklists of advice, accomplishments, and interpretations, Phil, of proposing open-ended directions for a mysterious story and for art making that never reaches resolution, Deb, and for indexing the name of every individual implicated in the art world, as you do, Martin. Even Yayoi Kusama's Infinity Net, which a series which she's been working on for over 50 years, is an obsessively impossible impulse to contain the infinite. And all of your work seeks to encapsulate art practice in some way, yet the very extensive record and proliferation of your objects suggests that this totalizing impulse is, of course, impossible. So why is this approach compelling for you, and why take on this Herculean task?
Oh, I thought you'd never ask. In the summer of 1969, when I was waiting the birth of my first child, I got a freelance job of compiling an index for a professor working on a book, and I discovered in the course of 3 months of preparing that indexes are the sexiest texts imaginable. You know, there's this effect of poetry, of unique efficiency of language, but there's hardly a poem that's got anything on a well-done index, which can sum up, say, the whole history of the universe in terms of what location on which page every important reference is to be found, like star maps, you know. It had to percolate from 1969 to 1982 when I first got really, really invested in literalizing it, but there it was, this amorous concentration of bits of information which in some sense brought a whole world into orbit around this reverie or that. And I feel this is what, at least we four on the panel do, but a lot of our compatriots as well. We find this way of sifting through language to find the key bits, the key moments. I could go even further back into childhood, panning for gold at Knott's Berry Farm, and find a metaphor for this, right?
Finding the jewels.
Yes.
Did you ever get
in the
any
dirt?
Gold?
No.
Yeah.
Despite their best efforts to salt it.
Well, you know, there's like two sort of really interesting questions there. One is that the kind of impulse of the artist to be a sort of omniscient figure and have like all of the answers, like a kind of like godlike power, which is, you know, very problematic in some ways. And I think, you know, there's a lot of artists who, well, I think, you know, in some ways we can just be guilty of it, you know, like this idea of, and I think about this a lot recently because Sarah Thornton's new book, 33 Artists in 3 Acts, she kind of has this question about, you know, how does the artist, you know, what is a successful artist? And it becomes this kind of like mastery of every aspect of your career, how you present yourself, what is, you know, your belief system and all of it, and like having an answer for everything. And yet she kind of playfully teases out in the book that nobody really has an answer for what it means to be an artist, or one that's not satisfactory for her. And, you know, for me, it's sort of like, you know, artists are asking questions that might not have an answer, and it seems inexhaustible that you would kind of try to like devote your life to answering a question that nobody really asked. And at the same time, just on a very like kind of practical level, when I was an art critic, I would just go and see show after show after show and keep these obsessive little notebooks. And I was trying to figure out another person's mind and what they were doing, and sort of trying to answer their question through writing. And at a certain point, they just kind of collapsed into developing, I guess, a critical language that would sort of challenge the authority of an art critic or a newspaper, and that what I was doing had to kind of rise to that same level. Even if it was a fiction or a parody or a satire, it had to kind of develop the story to seem like it could be the same as the kind of source material in a way. And so it required me to do a lot of writing, like to develop full profiles or an entire, section of the New York Times. And I guess, like the indexing thing isn't necessarily important to me as like fully developing the narrative to kind of answer a question in a kind of satisfactory way to make fun of the target in some way.
And I think in your work, I'm thinking of indexing more in terms of list making, these kind of inexhaustible lists.
Yeah, and I mean, and that really, a lot of that came out of like seeing 30 art shows in Williamsburg and kind of keeping these kind of crazy lists,
Of themes that emerge, right?
I do want to say that when Buzz says indexes are sexy, I've never thought about indexes that way, but I really think they are. And now it's really making me think about how with an index, it's open-ended so that anyone reading it can fill in the blanks or make it go anywhere. The possibilities are not shut down with an index or a list. But I guess I'm thinking back to, I was in a cab once with a cab driver, and the cab driver wanted to know, what do I do for a living? So I tried to explain it. And then it got to the point where I was trying to explain, well, I write, sometimes I write an interior dialogue that happens, inside my head. Different voices battling it out to figure out what the truth is about something or someone. And he said to me, I don't have those voices in my head. I didn't know if that's the truth, because I feel like I think everyone has those voices inside their head, and it's exhausting, right? So, but yeah, that for me is really what I do and what I'm interested in, is that always the second guessing yourself, that sort of, you say something, but then you're doubting it. And then you say something else, but then you doubt that, and it's just down this, rabbit hole of exhaustion and self-doubt, and so yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
Great.
I forgot what I was going to say. I think two things came to mind, and I don't know if this is an index or not, but the dictionary is my favorite list. Partly because language is this amazing, beautiful, and flawed thing, and to try to build a list that can explain what a word means, to me, is one of the craziest things we do. And most people who study language will poo-poo the dictionary immediately. So, but we all rely on it in a lot of ways. So I think for me, I take that, and a lot of the stuff that I work on, it's trying to control and get my arms around something, but it's, it always ends up impossible. Or even when I do, it's like, what, in the end, kind of like, it didn't really work out in some way or other. And for me, I come back a lot of times to our obsession with data. And that it's, to me, one of the crazier things that we do is try to collect all this data and be able to say, well, now we got it. This proves it. But then someone else can take that same data, as we know, and just say, well, this proves the complete opposite. And it's this constant thing. And I just heard this, this, if you're familiar with edge.org, it's this lots of smart people getting together and talking about what's going on in the world. And so they do this thing every year or every couple years where they ask the edge question. And the one this time around was, what great or what influential ideas need to be killed gotten rid of. And one of these people said that data can tell us anything. I'm really mangling, paraphrasing, but basically he was saying that, you know, data is fool's gold in a way, and we need to let go of that. And I really like grabbed onto that one. So, but you should check it out. That edge.org is really interesting, and that whole thing about what we should get rid of, fascinating, I think.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful artists and for coming to hear them speak today.